morning comes from Matthew chapter 19. We'll be reading from verse 11 to 15. But Jesus said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only to those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." Then little children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them. But Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. This is holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. Will you join me in prayer? Oh God, we give you thanks for your word that comes to us fresh this morning. I pray that the words that I speak would be a glory to you. I pray that you would speak through me, and I pray that you would speak in spite of me, and that the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts would be acceptable to you. Amen. So this is the third sermon in our sermon series called "The Bible is Queer and Genderful." So this is number 3. Today we're going to continue our focus on gender and gender identity in the Bible. Last week I thought it was important to say, and I'd like to say it again this morning, just as a reminder that gender identity is different from sexual orientation. So sometimes those things are kind of lumped together when we talk about them, but it's important to know that those are different things. We all have a gender, we all have ways of expressing our gender identity, we all have a sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is about your relationship to others, who you are romantically, sexually attracted to. That is about your sexual orientation. Your gender identity is about how you see yourself, how you see and identify yourself. So you can identify or be male, female, both, or neither. This is your gender identity, how you see and understand your internal sense of who you are. Your gender identity may not match the sex assigned to you at birth. It might, but it might not. So I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as female, so that means I am cisgender. So that's another term we use, cisgender. That means I was assigned female at birth, I identify as female. Your gender identity may not match the sex you were assigned at birth. And if that's the case, you would identify as transgender. So these are terms that we use. Some people don't like those categories at all and may not choose to use that language at all either. And so it's important, as we said last week, to ask people to make sure that we're using language that corresponds with how they want to be identified. So I know we're all in different places around this. Some of us, this is very familiar to us. For others of us, we're learning this is new. So I want to make sure that we're using language and able to be on the same page. So I wanted to start there with some of those definitions because we use them and we talk about them. So this morning I wanted to pick up on a thread from our sermon last week and delve a little bit deeper. Last week I made the claim, we talked about this, that in the Bible there are texts, there are stories about people who did not conform to the gender binary. And by gender binary, I mean the social system where it is assumed that people come in only two genders, male or female. That's the gender binary. So the gender binary is the norm in many white Western contexts. It's It's not the norm in all cultures and all contexts, but in the white Western context, it tends to be the norm. But the Bible bears witness to people who did not conform to the gender binary and who lived lives in gender roles that did not match their assigned sex at birth. This alone is very important to know. It's very important as a starting place. We need to know that. And we talked about this last week, that the presence of a third gender or multiple genders have existed since antiquity. And so this is nothing new, and the Bible witnesses to this. So that's very important as a starting place. And today, what I want to talk about today is that the most obvious example of non-binary folks in the Bible are people who are called eunuchs. So you've already heard this term already in worship this morning. Eunuch is an old word. We don't use that anymore. But there are many examples of eunuchs in the Bible. Eunuchs were men who were castrated. This was actually a pretty well-known practice in places like Assyria, in Babylon, in Persia. All of these nations used castration for different purposes. Some as a penalty for crime, and it was a way of marking someone as a slave for life. Other times, eunuchs were created to form a people who were considered neither male or female, and were able to move easily between gendered spaces. So, for example, eunuchs could serve in a king's harem and guard the harem. So all of the king's many wives would have a eunuch as their servant and guard. And they were considered non-threatening because they couldn't impregnate the women who belonged at that time to the king. So they were often trusted as kind of guards of the king's harem. But they also often served as close advisors, sometimes companions to kings and to queens, and so were allowed into spaces that were specifically designated for females or for males. And so they had this kind of liminal role. They were neither male nor female, somewhere in the social ladder, a few steps above women, but definitely a few steps below men. So they were in this kind of liminal gender space. And eunuchs occupied that space. It was not problematic in Assyria, Babylon, and in Persia, but it was for the Israelites. It was problematic for the Israelites. Clear boundaries are what provide an identity and distinction for the Hebrew people. So we see many laws, for example, in the Hebrew scriptures that prohibit kind of a disruption of clear boundaries. So we see laws like prohibitions against mixing fibers for clothing or for planting multiple kinds of crops in a field. That was prohibited because there was a category and a place for everything, and that needed to be understood. And so we find a law also from Deuteronomy 23:1 that commands that no man who has been castrated can be admitted into the assembly of the Lord. So imagine if you were a eunuch and you were serving during the Babylonian Empire when many Hebrew folks were taken from their land and brought into Babylon. Imagine if you were a eunuch and were serving and then were returning home after your time in exile. There was no place for you. You now were in a different category. You were neither male nor female. Eunuchs found themselves cut off from their people, not allowed to share in God's covenant. Plus, it was a disgrace for them as it was for women who could not bear children. If you could not reproduce, you were not blessed. And it was through your children that you would be remembered and you would have a name. So, imagine what that would have been like. And with this context in mind, think about the words of the prophet Isaiah that you just heard this morning that are most striking and amazing. This portion of Isaiah was actually written as people were coming out of Babylon and were trying to figure out how to be community again, how to reshape their identity. And after having been scoured and taken against their will, they were coming back and trying to figure this out. And the prophet says, do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who do the things that please me, and hold fast to my covenant, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Thus says the Lord, who gathers the outcasts of Israel. This really is an incredible word in the Hebrew Bible. A prophetic word that breaks in as God demands a remedy to the situation of people being excluded from the covenant. A whole group of people have been excluded based on their not fitting into a gender category that is clearly defined. God declares them acceptable. And notice something here. God does not say they should change. God does not say they should conform now to society's roles. They should not somehow try to fit in by having a specific gendered role. No, they are accepted, period. And in fact, the previous understandings of what it means to be fruitful, what it means to be blessed are now changed. That narrow definition has expanded, so fruitfulness and blessing God gives even to those who don't have the ability to procreate. I will give you a name, your name will be remembered for eternity. This is the word that God is speaking and upending people's previous definitions and understandings of meaning. The whole community has to be transformed now. It's not the eunuchs who need to change. The community is changing and needs to be transformed into something entirely new, like nothing folks had ever seen before. Isn't it a shame that for so many people, and especially for queer and transgender folk today, that the message that you receive when you walk into a church is often change first, then we will accept you. Conform first to the gender binary, to the gender roles that society expects of you, then we will accept you. Churches do this, I think, because many churches in North America have become captive to the domination system. And I know this is kind of a depressing outlook, but I really believe this, that we are captive in many ways, churches, and we need to break free from that. And we, unfortunately, are not often modeled on the reign of God as much as we are mimicking the white, Western, male domination system. And we treat, therefore, those who don't fit into that as outsiders. And yet what Isaiah is witnessing to today is that the whole community needs to be transformed. And often the people in most need of transformation are the people in the center of power and privilege who don't see themselves as needing to be transformed, right? I mean, this is what it means to be captives. You don't see yourself as needing to be transformed, and so you just expect others to kind of align with you. So if we think about Jesus, he often is challenging people also in those positions. He challenges all of us. But he often has a particularly kind of harsh and direct word to people who are in positions of power and privilege. And that is a little bit of what is going on in the Matthew text that we heard this morning. I am curious though, has anyone ever heard this passage about eunuchs from within Jesus? So is this new? I mean, people have heard it, yeah, or maybe at least like for the second or third time. But do you hear it read in church? Or, no, I mean, this is unusual. It's a very odd thing that Jesus says. It kind of strikes us as like, what are you talking about? And what is going on? So the context of this passage is that Jesus is actually arguing with some male religious authorities, as he often is. And what came before is he's talking to them about marriage and divorce and when it's okay to divorce your wife, and that's a whole another thing that we could get into that we don't have time to get into now. But then after that, kind of he's talking with them, he goes into this passage about eunuchs, and he says, not everyone can accept this teaching, first of all. So that's a cue that this might be a little bit difficult for us. So there are eunuchs who have been eunuchs from birth, he said. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Okay, so many biblical scholars argue that Jesus is not speaking here literally about eunuchs, but that he's talking about celibacy or abstinence. Yeah, I don't know. And we could talk a long time about that. But that's often related to what comes before about marriage and divorce. People have connected this kind of like well, okay, it's so hard to be married, I'll just be celibate kind of a thing. Anyway, that's really off topic and has all kinds of problems in a different sense. But anyway, but many scholars connect that with the passage before and say that this is he's talking about celibacy or abstinence. So, and it's interesting if you look back at some of the early interpreters of this text, people were very confused. Even in the first 100, 200 years of Christianity, interpreters took this passage sometimes, yes, literally. Men would castrate themselves and would see that they're living outside of their assigned sex as something that this passage was calling them to do. So there's a lot of different interpretations around here. But what I want to put forth this morning is what some queer and trans theologians have been asking about this passage, and that is, how and when did we decide that Jesus wasn't speaking literally about eunuchs? We take all kinds of things literally in the Bible, but let's not take this one literally, right? I mean, this is very interesting. Why wouldn't he be speaking literally about eunuchs? They were around during Jesus' time. They were not particularly known for being celibate or for being models of celibacy. So in fact, they were often scorned and looked down on for not being, quote, real men, for not being real anything. They didn't fit a category that was easily understood. They were often even referred to with words like monstrous, illegitimate, false, not really real. And of course, if we think about it, these are the kinds of people that Jesus tends to hang out with, lift up, people whose bodies, whose lives were not considered real or legitimate. One scholar I read even suggested, which I think is very plausible, that Jesus and his disciples were name called. Oh, you're just a bunch of eunuchs. You're not real men. After all, Jesus and his male followers left their homes. They left their responsibilities as men. They left their responsibilities as upholders of tradition. They left their access to power and status. So Jesus may very well have been accused of being a eunuch. Either way, he knew of the eunuchs' marginalized status and their tendency to be seen as not real or legitimate. And so what he does in these 3 sentences, much like Isaiah does, is pretty remarkable if we take it literally. He says, there are those who have been eunuchs from birth. And he could well be speaking of people who were born with diverse sex characteristics like intersex folks talk about or identify today. And then he says, those who have been made eunuchs by others. Jesus here could very well be speaking about people who were castrated against their will, which happened. And when Jesus says there are those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom, he could be talking about people who are called to live outside of their assigned sex for the sake of the reign of God. Jesus does not say eunuchs need to be healed or changed to enter the kingdom. He doesn't say that they need fixing or in order to be included in the reign of God. There's no kind of illegitimacy or need for fixing that's implied here. What is truly in need of healing is the blindness of the people in power who can't see the eunuchs and can't see children and barren women as living already into the reign of God. That's what needs transformation. But not everyone can accept this teaching, Jesus says. This is hard. And I think it is hard for people in the center, for people in power, to understand and to begin to be changed and transformed. What I find so beautiful and liberating is that what is shown here is that to live into your identity as queer or trans is part of your calling. It's part of your calling. God and Jesus call you to move outside of the gender binary in order to be your most authentic self. It's to shift and be transformed. Jesus said that eunuchs are not only included, they are models of discipleship. They are called to move out of bounds and be as they are for the sake of the reign of God. And so we must take, I believe, our cues from people who are modeling that call to move out of bounds. Queer and trans folk are our witnesses. They are witnessing in the church and to the church. And so we're called to watch that and to move and to figure out and think about the ways that we're called to move out of bounds. Always for the sake of the reign of God. Always for the sake of the reign of compassion and mercy, the love of ourselves and our neighbors,